Hello, and welcome to Kyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play set in the Eberron campaign world. It's Friday, so you're watching a Kyber Shards Answers, and I am indeed on my own today. We're having to record this ahead of time, because I'm going to be out of town all next week, so we won't have time to do an episode the way we normally would, and didn't have really a good opportunity to get together with one of the players and record a Q&A as we usually would. So today we're going to be looking at a bit of DMing advice and a bit of lore for Eberron. This was a suggestion from one of our patrons that we talk a bit about giants and Drow in Zindric. This will become this is actually quite appropriate to what happened in the most recent episode, as we dealt with a little bit of that lore. So it works out. But I want to kind of broaden it, because one of the interesting things is that of the big important things in the history of Eberron, one of them that's not very thoroughly explored is actually the culture and history of the giants. Giants are important in Eberron. They are especially important if we're running in Zindric, which of course our campaign is. But unlike, for example, the hobgoblins of Dargoon, the giants they kind of get short shrift in terms of detail. This is deliberate. It's not laziness or anything like that in the part of the various writers who wrote old 3.5 sources or more recent ones. It's deliberate because the giant civilization was destroyed so thoroughly and so catastrophically that records have been more or less lost. It's also deliberate because Zindric is supposed to be a mysterious continent. So if we have a really orderly history for it, then it loses some of that mystery. It's also intended to be kind of a DM's playground, where if you've got something you want to throw it somewhere and it doesn't fit anywhere else in Eberron, you can put it in Zindric. And again, likewise, if we put too much structure onto Zindric, then we lose some of that flexibility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of workshop what I think giants might have been like, based on some of the other ways in which Eberron has kind of twisted the nature of other typical enemies of adventurers. Again, that in and of itself is a common twist in Eberron, that beings that we are used to thinking of as the adventurers' enemies are not necessarily inherently evil. The loss of, or the removal, the good, I think, removal of alignment being tied to species applies potentially, or should apply, to giants as well. So let's talk a little about what we know about giants. If you were attending Morgrave University in Sharn and you sat in on the History of Zindric 101, what sort of thing might you expect to learn? Not much. We know that giant civilization rose tens of thousands of years ago in Zindric. We know that they were visited by and made contact with the dragons of Arganessen, and that the dragons of Arganessen were the ones who taught the giants magic initially, taught them the arcane sciences initially, and this set off a massive expansion and development, a revolution in giant society, and allowed giant society to begin forming these big, highly advanced civilizations as they began to develop their own magic, a lot of which has influenced the development of a lot of quote-unquote modern scientific magic that we see in Eberron. The sort of broad magic as technology thing comes from, a lot of the early ideas come from the giants, including, there are some suggestions in some of the source books, things like the Warforged and the creation forges that Cannith uses, elemental binding. All of these things were discovered by giants and rediscovered by groups like the Zil Gnomes and Cannith and House Cannith. So the giants had an extremely advanced civilization, kind of Atlantis-like, in Eberron. And then it was all destroyed catastrophically. We know that the giants underwent 3 major wars that ultimately destroyed their civilization. First, there was the invasion of Dalkor into Eberron, the Plane of Dreams, by the fiendish evil Quarry. No one knows why, no one knows what started it, but the giants were able to do this by destroying one of Eberron's 13 moons and permanently, or so it is to be hoped, permanently blocking Dalkor from ever becoming coterminous with Zendrik, and travel between Dalkor, physical travel between Dalkor and Eberron is now impossible. Then, weakened by that invasion, the giants underwent a rebellion of the Elves. We know the giants had dominated the Elves. Depending on which book you're reading, it's either implied that Elves were captured from the Feywild and made into slaves by the giants, or that Elven city-states were dominated and subjugated and made tributary to the giants. If we were just taking a historical example, it's likely that both would be true. If we were just thinking of it as a real history, probably both would be true. Some Elves may have become actual slaves to the giants, while other Elven city-states were simply forced into tributary status. The Elves rebelled, fought a long war, and were mixed results. In some cases, the Elves were winning. In some cases, the Elves were choosing to flee to the island of Erenol. The giants responded in two very important ways. One, through the creation of the Drow, to be anti-elves, to hunt and kill the elves. Elves who had stayed loyal were transformed through mage breeding, a process that we're familiar with from House Vaedalis in Eberron. Again, another giant science recreated by a dragon-marked house. Through mage breeding, the giants bound shadow to the forms of elves and created the Drow to fight for them against the elves. And we know also that as the war reached its climax, the giants were preparing some unknown, massive, cataclysmic magic with which to defeat their elven rebels when the dragons invaded. And the dragons invaded to, presumably, because the draconic prophecy told them that this had to be stopped, that this would result in something too terrible to imagine and had to be stopped. And so the giants catastrophically destroyed Zendrik and laid terrible curses on it to prevent the giants from ever rising again. Fast forward to today, and giants are more or less as they are in other D&D settings, with some significant changes, but more or less. So that's really all we've got as far as history. We have a few named entities. We have the Sulat League, which was a group of mages and artificers among the giants who created a lot of the giants' great magical artifacts and creations, and who are the ones who mage-bred the Drow. We have the Kulsir Dominion, which was a highly militaristic, conquest-centered empire that was the empire that fought the war against the Quarry, and was also the empire that was brought down by the Elven Rebellion and the Draconic Invasion. And then we have a very, very lightly touched on one called the Group of 11, which was a alliance of 11 city-states run by powerful mages that was overtaken by the Kulsir Dominion. And so those names and a little bit about each one and that rough history, which we mostly get because it relates to the elves and the dragons, is really all the detail we're given of the giants of ancient Zendrik. Today, we have 4 groups that appear in various source books. There's the Battalion of the Basalt Tower, which are fire giants, and they are, much like the Kulsir Dominion, highly militaristic and interested in conquest. And they have, in fact, recently, at least in recent human memory, attacked Stormreach in an attempt to destroy it. There's the Dominion of Purity, which is interested in reforming the ancient giant empire and rediscovering all of the old giant artifacts and knowledge, and have already gathered dozens of giant tribes and thousands of giants to their banner in an attempt to recreate the old giant society. There's the Scriveners of the Sky, who are kind of like the Dominion of Purity in that they're really fascinated by the past, but they're just seeking knowledge, and they're mainly storm and cloud giants. They want to know and preserve the history of their people, of the ancient past of their people. And then there are the giants of Rushame, who are presented as highly benevolent, as a druidic order, and mostly made up of what in most settings would be considered the lesser giants: hill giants, jungle giants, stone giants. And they are druidic. We've met them in Kyber Shards. And their focus is on the land. Rushame is the spiritual embodiment of Zendrik, and that's the center of their focus and their faith, and their practice is to protect the land and preserve it, and to protect people who are in the land from harm when possible. But sometimes, hard lessons have to be learned. The giants of Rushame are particularly concerned about the traveler's curse and the madness of crowds, which is one of the curses that the dragons laid on Zendrik that causes, or at least has seemed to cause, any large civilization to descend into madness and violence and fall into destruction. Stormreach is starting to get large. The Dominion of Purity is starting to get large. Either one of these could theoretically bring about the madness of crowds again. Just a little... Again, a lot of this is really created for us to create adventure hooks. And that's where I want to get into the issue of canon today, because what I've presented are what we might call canon, in that they are found in source books. But D&D source books aren't really canon in most cases. What D&D source books are is a toolbox. Keith Baker is very open about this when he talks about Eberron, is if there's room in it, if it's in D&D, there's room for it in Eberron. And if it's in Eberron, take it or leave it. Use it if you want to. So you might run a game in Zendrik that doesn't have all of those civilizations. You might run a game in Zendrik where you borrow the ordning idea from other D&D settings where giants exist in a carefully organized caste system, running from cloud giants up at the top to hill giants down at the bottom, and the various giant types stratified there in a very, very rigid social caste system. That's what giants are like in other settings, and a lot of DMs will run giants like that in Zendrik, which is totally fine. You can do that. You can say that that's how the old giant empires functioned, is on that rigid caste system, and that modern giant society has more or less lost that, although the relative strength of the various types of giants still reflects that. But I don't want to do that with my campaign. I don't want the ordning. And the reason I don't want the ordning is because there's something that I sometimes refer to as the Eberron twist. The Eberron twist is where you take a traditional enemy of adventurers and you alter something about it while staying true to its fundamental nature. Lots of things have got this going on in Eberron. Orcs are probably the most common example, because in many settings, orcs are fundamentally evil, fundamentally destructive, fundamentally deadly. In Eberron, orcs are chaotic. They're not going to form what we'd think of as orderly civilizations. They're not going to build great cities. They're going to be tribal. They're going to be more chaotic. But they're not fundamentally evil. In fact, orcs are very important in Eberron as druidic tribes, and some orcs are part of the service of the Silver Flame and defend Eberron against demons and fiendish forces. So you take something fundamental about orcs. They're chaotic, they're wild, they're passionately emotional, but not evil, and not necessarily, in fact, pretty unlikely to be the player's enemies in many cases. Dragons. Eberron does away with the attachment of alignment to the color of a dragon. Metallic dragons are not all good. Chromatic dragons are not all evil. And the dragons are also not individual. They're orderly. They have a civilization on Arganessen. There's a whole civilization built around dragons. Goblinoids. We think of goblinoids and we think of bugbears and goblins, which are kind of low-level threats for the players, and then hobgoblins, which are just militaristic conquerors. But in Eberron, it's more complicated than that. They are all they're subspecies of the same species, and once they're the original empire on Corvair, on our main continent in Eberron. They're the original empire. Everything, all the old ruins on Corvair are Dakani ruins from the old Dakani Empire. And they were fundamentally important in defeating an invasion of outsiders, much like the Giants were. But for them, it was the Dalkor rather than the Kori. And now we have a very disunified Goblinoid society that's trying to be rebuilt. And this is the reason I don't want to use the Ordning, because it's really well established, as far as the Goblinoids of Eberron, that what worked about the Dakani Empire was that hobgoblins, goblins, and bugbears all had a perfectly defined role in the society, and everyone played that role to a T, and that's why it worked. The society worked because it was deeply lawful, and it had this fundamental caste society. The Ordning is too similar to that. I don't want to do that in my version of Giant Society. So we're going to throw out the Ordning. I have a couple of other reasons for that. One is we have already a few organizations that are made of multiple types of giants. The Dominion of Purity and the Giants of Rushame are both made of more than one kind of giant. So I don't want to imply a strict caste system. And also, I don't really like it. It's already kind of done in the Dakani Empire, so I don't want to do it in my giant empire. So I'm going to take a different idea that's suggested in a couple of places in various Eberron sourcebooks. In older editions of D&D, you had lots of other kinds of giants. In 5th edition, so far, what we've got are primarily our kind of elemental giants: hill giants, stone giants, fire giants, frost giants, cloud giants, storm giants, so forth. These are all kind of elemental-based giants. But in old editions, we got other kinds of giants: death giants and eldritch giants. And in Secrets of Zendrick, we had primordial giants. I want to suggest a different ordering of things. When the Giants' empire collapsed and the dragons laid all these terrible curses on Zendrick, they also cursed the giants. And the nature of this curse is that the giants stopped being one. They stopped being one species. We have that loss of unity, which is the same problem in the Dakani Empire, but I want to use it in a different way. In this case, the loss of unity is physical. The different types of giants, the giants were transformed. They began to branch off into these different types. So before, we have one kind of being that is a giant, and whether it's an eldritch giant or a primordial giant or a death giant, I don't know. We'll worry about that later when if it becomes important in the campaign. That's what we'll worry about. Let's say there's just one kind of giant, and when the dragons invade and curse the giants, it creates a sort of Tower of Babel thing where the giants are split into these different groups with very, very different interests, very, very different environments that they can tolerate, and very, very different intelligences and strengths. Frost giants and fire giants, in very few places in the world can frost giants and fire giants both live comfortably. And this is going to create a situation where the giants are inherently scattered. They're not scattered by language, as in the Tower of Babel story. Instead, they're scattered by a fundamental change in their physiology that requires them to scatter to survive. They can't all live in the same places anymore. And so now what we see are giants in small knots, giants disunified, but giants unable to regroup and form the massive power that they once were. And so if you're running a giant-centered campaign, if you're adapting Storm King's Thunder or the older stories against the giants, or that kind of thing, if you're adapting those things for Eberron and you wanted to use this idea, then the big threat is whoever your big bad is trying to reunify the giants to create a unified, and I'd probably use the Dominion of Purity to create an enemy there who's trying to reunify the giants into a great militaristic force that can reconquer the old Kulsir Dominion. And that's how I would do it. Well, I was about to say that's not where my campaign is going, but I really don't know where Kyber Shards is going long term. It's going to depend a lot on what the players decide. This is one of the things that I just want to, again, reiterate about the way I think about D&D settings is there's not really a canon. And I'm bad about this. I read all the source books, and I'm inclined. If you've listened to Eberron Renewed, you know there are occasions where I slipped up and accidentally corrected Eric on some issue of canon. And that's not a good way to think about it. The good way to think about Eberron is that it's your Eberron. In my Eberron, the ordning did not exist in the old giant empire. And in fact, frost giants and fire giants didn't actually exist in the old giant empire. There were just giants. And those differentiations, that disunity, is created by the curse that destroys the ancient giant empire. And we end up with this great disunity. And a giant villain might be trying to reunify or recreate it. And if you have access to the book Secrets of Zindric, it has a lot of great hooks for that kind of campaign. So if you're looking to run a Zindric campaign centered on giants, that's a really good way to go about it. All right, so I have a couple of questions that were related to elves and drow, and I want to deal with those that we got from our patrons. So first off, Shelby Johnson asks, how do the drow and giants of Eberron differ from their cousins in Forgotten Realms or base D&D? Well, I've dealt with giants for the last few minutes here, so I'll skip past that. As far as drow, I have to first admit I'm not super familiar with Forgotten Realms. That's not something I've not read the Drizzt Do'Urden books. I've never read through all of the Forgotten Realms thing. I'm in I'm in an occasional Forgotten Realms campaign now, and so I'm starting to learn a bit of the lore of Faerun, but it's not a setting I know everything about. But in terms of base D&D, I'm relatively familiar. So how do Drow differ from this? Well, one, the Drow are not inherently tied to a demonic force or to an evil god, I guess, the way that the Drow in most D&D are through the connection to Lolth. Additionally, the Drow are not, therefore, inherently evil in Eberron. Or at least not evil in the sense of they want to murder everyone. They could be evil in a different sense, or they could incline towards evil in a different sense, in that they tend to lack empathy for outsiders. I've kind of talked about alignment on a lot of places, but this is kind of one of the ways I tend to think about alignment, is that evil is not a thing that a person is, it's a thing that a person does. And so Drow society might seem evil to an outsider because the Drow are so focused on survival. One very interesting thing that's different about the Drow from other elves in Eberron is that other elves in Eberron have all built their society around the idea of immortality. The Valinar replay the mighty actions of their ancestors, and so their ancestors live on. The Arenal bind the spirits of their important ancestors to objects, or even preserve them living, undying, across the ages, so as not to lose them. The ancient Cavalrine elves of Zindric invented necromancy and the idea of the Lich and vampires in order to try and live forever. Elves are focused around the idea of immortality. But in terms of what's written about them, we don't actually see that in the Drow. I would suggest the reason for that is that Zindric is such an intensely dangerous place that the average Drow lifespan is probably much shorter than the average lifespan of an elf in Arenal or Valinar, because so many Drow are likely to die just of natural hazards. And so the Drow are less focused on immortality. And instead, I would suggest are also going to be much less individualistic than other elves might be. Arenal is not usually presented as a highly individualistic society, but I would suggest the Drow are going to take this to a whole other level, because I think the Drow are going to be so tribally focused that to a Drow, and this is, if you read a lot of anthropology about tribal societies, this is one of the things that comes out. To a Drow's self. So if we take Sole, Ilya's father, Sole Moonspear, in Kyber Shards. Sole is himself, but he has a greater self, without which he will feel incomplete, and that is not just his immediate family, but his clan, the Moonspears, and whatever tribal group the Moonspears belong to. Beyond that, all of those Sole would experience as part of himself, not in a hive mind kind of way, but just in a very fundamental way. The idea of yourself as belonging is way more fundamental than it is to most Western societies that are highly individualistic. And I would suggest more so than you would see in Erenal or Valinar, even though Erenal, at least, is a fairly group-conscious society, or seems to me to be. Anyway, I feel like I got off on a bit of a tangent there. So the Drow are very different from other elves. The Drow's origin is very different. They're created, supposedly, or at least that's one version you could go with. They're created by the Sulat League in the ancient giant empire. And we also have different cultures of Drow. This is something that Laura asks about. Can you talk about the different cultures of the Drow? Are there three kinds? Like there are three kinds, but how do they function day to day? How do they differ from each other? Stuff like that. We have lots of Drow cultures, or we have 3 detailed Drow cultures in various Eberron books. But Baker points out there could be Drow all over Zendrik. The big thing is that the Drow were scattered across Zendrik when the dragons came. Most of the elves had escaped when the dragons came, but the Drow had not. The Drow were still there. They were stuck there. And so the Drow were caught up in the destruction of the giants and were scattered around. And the Drow responded in many very different ways. We see the Volkori Drow, which are the majority that people are aware of, who take to the jungles and form semi-nomadic tribes focused around the worship of nature spirits, most particularly Volkor, the scorpion, but also the worship of other primal nature spirits. So Volkori Drow are going to be inclined towards ranger, barbarian, druid, very primal focused things. You're not going to see as many clerics. You might see a cleric of Volkor, but not, for the most part, not as many clerics. Instead, it's going to be druids. It's going to be barbarian. It's going to be rangers. These are going to be your Drow classes. That's one, is this semi-nomadic tribe, and we've met them in Sole and his family. The next group that we see mentioned in Eberron books are the Suletar. The Suletar Drow remained loyal to the giants right up to the end and now seek to preserve that knowledge. The name of the Sulat League is even preserved in them. Suletar means firebinder, and the Suletar have mastered a lot of the old giant techniques for binding elementals, particularly fire elementals. So we see a lot of really advanced magic items being present among the Suletar. So if you're creating a Suletar warband, you're going to see flame tongue longswords. The Suletar sometimes have these cool fire sleds, which are like miniature elemental airships, like 2-person elemental airships that can fly around because of bound fire elementals. Lots of crazy fire weapons and fire powers are going to be present in the Suletar. And the Suletar tend to live among and around old giant ruins. And you might see them on friendly relations with some groups of giants. We could see, if you're creating a giant campaign centered around the Dominion of Purity, you could easily make the Suletar Drow allied with the Dominion of Purity, wanting to see the giant civilization rise up. But you could also present them as wanting to replace the giants. The giants proved to be weak. The giants proved to be incapable of survival, and they, in any case, enslaved us. And so now it's our turn. It's the turn of the elves, and in particular the Suletar, who have this mastery of ancient giant knowledge. The Suletar are going to know more about the ancient giants than most people, including some giants. And the Suletar are going to they're going to be dangerous. They're going to have, any Suletar warband is going to have magic items. It's going to have some of the more interesting classes. The Suletar are going to be more organized. They're going to be more orderly, more, city focused. You might find Suletar dwelling in actual cities, probably built among the ruins of old giants, kind of like Stormreach is. And I would say you're probably seeing more wizards and sorcerers, fighters, maybe some artificers, if you focused real heavily on the fire element of it. There's not much information about Suletar religion, so you might have clerics, but you might also not, just depending on how you want to interpret that. But we don't have much information about Suletar religion, so we don't know. I don't know what domains you would pick for that. But if you want them to have, a clerical tradition, you could. And then the third group, who have not even been mentioned in Kyber Shards and who no one knows about. I mean, that's really the important thing here is most people in the Stormreach don't know this stuff. The Suletar are like a rumor. The Volkori are well known to scholars and explorers in Stormreach. The Suletar are a rumor. This third group is entirely unknown, and it's the Umbragian. It's a group of Drow who fled underground when the Giants invaded and bound themselves to a dark force they found there called the Umbra. The Umbragian played a big role in Eberron Renewed, in Eric's campaign there. So if you want to see Eric's interpretation of the Umbragian, as well as a little bit, to a certain degree, my interpretation of the Umbragian, you can check out there. You can check out Eberron Renewed, our podcast. The Umbragian are pretty much unknown. They are probably closer to your traditional Drow in other settings. If you wanted to introduce those societies of Drow, the Umbragian are a good place to do that. They live underground. They have shadowy powers, that kind of thing. But one interesting tidbit that Keith Baker has pointed out that I've never seen played out, including in the Umbragian character that I created in Eberron Renewed and in the way that we played with the Umbragian in Eberron Renewed, one interesting thing that Keith Baker has pointed out is that to the Umbragian, places like Sharn would seem like a backwater, which implies that there is a highly advanced, highly technological culture somewhere under Eberron, somewhere in Eberron's Underdark, in Kyber, run by these Umbragian. And that's a really interesting hook. That's really all we get. We get a little more about the Umbra. We get there's a great article from an old Dragon magazine about the Umbragian that's pretty interesting. It talks about the Umbragian as having a lot of rogues and soul knives and warlocks. That these are all would all be common classes among the Umbragian, and gets into that in a lot of detail. So if you want to check those out, the article is just called The Umbragian. I recommend that. It's a great article. I used it very heavily for my Umbragian character. So we have those three cultures. What are they like day to day? The Volkori Drow are going to be focused on survival. They're going to be moving from one place to another, or settled in camp and hunting and gathering. It's going to be a very, very focused way of life. It's going to be about survival. It's going to be about protecting the tribe and ensuring that the tribe has enough resources to survive. So the Volkori Drow are going to be very, very suspicious of outsiders. They're, on the other hand, going to be expert guides. That's what Sully Moonspear does for a living. They're going to be expert guides. They could be really valuable allies, but they might also just ambush you and kill you to take your stuff. I think a good way to think about the Volkori Drow, if this is a familiar fandom for you, is in Dune, the Fremen. I would suggest that the Volkori are to the jungles of Zindric as the Fremen are to the deserts of Arrakis. They're highly insular, somewhat isolated. They deal with others, but reluctantly. Their focus is on the tribe, and they're extremely dangerous if you anger them. And they're mysterious enough that it's hard to know whether you've angered them, unless you do something stupid like threaten to harm one of them. The Suletar, I would suggest if you were in a Suletar city, you would see more traditional city life. You'd see people, you'd see art, you'd see a more hierarchical society with rulers and government. I would suggest. There's probably not many Suletar cities if they're out there in the jungle at all, but those that are out there are they're sophisticated. They'd be what we would recognize as a civilization. Your adventurers, if they could be friendly with them, if they could make friends and be able to safely enter their cities, these would be places of refuge out in Zindric. Coming upon a Suletar city might save your life if you're lost out in the jungle, because they also are going to know the place, know the land very, very well. And they're going to have goods for sale and might even have inns to stay in, depending on how sophisticated you want to, and how, well, not so much how sophisticated, but how widespread you want the society to be, and also what its relationship is to the giants. If you're viewing the Suletar as an enemy, then those cities might not at all be safe. The Suletar might also be a good enemy to face if you are trying to go into giant ruins, as they're going to be also after the goods found in giant ruins. And then Umbragian life, there's really no way to say what individual Umbragian life would be like. You'd have to create it yourself. Generally, the Umbragian are constantly in a war against the Dalkor and the aberrations of Khyber. They're constantly threatened by that, and they are slowly losing the war. The Umbragian have apparently created a very vast and complex society underneath Eberron, but it's under attack, and they're losing. And so any Umbragian is going to be focused on the war. It's going to be focused on survival. Umbragian on the surface are going to be looking for allies or looking for tools with which to fight. And if you go down into Khyber, and you encounter the Umbragian, it's likely that you're encountering a war party out fighting for the survival of their people. They might be enemies, depending on the situation you meet them in, or they might be sympathetic allies that you need to help and defend. In terms of published D&D adventures, Out of the Abyss would be an excellent adventure to run with an Umbragian focus, I think. Just as you could run Storm King's Thunder with a giant focus in Zendrick. I think that would work pretty well. So that would be the big differences that I would see in those three societies as they're described. And again, they're not all described in a great deal of detail. The Volkori and the Umbragian are described in the most detail, the Suletar more lightly. But that would be the big distinctions there. And then Eric had asked, what types of giants are left on your Zendrick? On my Zendrick, I would say the main types that you would find in the monster manual are all there. And if I was looking to create a special encounter, I might try and adapt some of the rarer types, sun giants, death giants, eldritch giants, and use them as like special, really powerful giants. Maybe giants who've recovered the power that they once had in the old society. Another thing that's sometimes suggested that I probably wouldn't use if my campaign went in that direction is that the giant empires weren't ruled by giants. They were ruled by titans or empyreans. I don't mind that, and probably some of the giant societies would be, especially guys like ideas like titans. But I don't know. I don't love that. And also, 5th edition has really altered the idea of titans and the idea of empyreans. And so, within the bounds of 5th edition, I would probably not go in that direction. But that's another direction you could go, is you could use Empyreans as the old ones. And since Empyreans are since Empyreans are immortal, you could easily run a campaign where whoever is leading the Dominion of Purity is a reincarnated Empyrean ruler from the Age of Giants and is trying to restore the old giant empire. Anyway, that's kind of my rundown on how I think of giants for the purposes of our campaign, and a little bit of how I think of Drow. I'm fairly confident I have not spoiled anything of what's coming. I know the things that I have plans for, but the players get such a strong vote in where we actually go. So how much giant and how much Drow will we see in Khyber Shards? You're asking the wrong person, to be quite honest. So we'll see, I guess. Anyway, in the description below, you can find links to all of our social media. We do very much appreciate your comments and likes on these videos. All of them help the great algorithm to get our videos out to more people. If there are other things you'd like to see for these Khyber Shards Answers episodes, other things you'd like to see us use these Friday shorts for, please let us know in comments below. And let us know what interesting bits of D&D canon you've altered for your campaign down in the comments below. In the meantime, New episode drops on Monday. I think it's a pretty funny one, so I hope you'll come around and watch. And until then, this has been Kyber Shards, and thanks for rolling with us.